Today we're going to be talking about hyperlinks, or links as they're more commonly called, and how you can use them to link your document with others out there. Now, links are really what make the web a web. It's this whole idea that different links built together create this kind of knowledge that search engines or you yourself can gain by going from page to page to page with hopefully related material. So let's get right into how you create a link on your page. Links are called anchor links, and that's where we get the A for in the A tag. When you use an anchor tag, the A tag, you're going to need to make sure that you have two different parts. You need a hyperreference and you need content. So the hyperreference is just the reference to the location of the new content. So in this case, I used http www.umich.edu. That tells the browser, if somebody clicks on this link, this is where I want you to request the new page from. We also need to have content. The content is what we call the clickable part. In this case, it's text. I would actually click on an underlined text that says University of Michigan. But in some cases, it might be an image instead. So what types of links can we have? Some of the most common are called absolute links. We also have relative links, internal links, and graphical links. And I'm going to show you an example of each one of those. With an absolute reference in the href section, we need to put a fully formed URL. You need to have the HTTP or HTTPS, the address, and any type of extra document name you want. So if you remember, there's three parts to a URL. You have the protocol, the host, and the document. You need to include all of those if you have an absolute reference. All right? Everything else is still pretty much the same. For a relative reference, we slightly change what goes into the href. Instead of linking to some outside or even internal web page, we're only going to put, in this case, the file name. So in this case, we're going to link to page2.html. You might get slightly more in depth than that, where you can include also some sort of folder name. So in this case, we'd be going to the file called page2.html, but it's in a different folder called docs. The third way we can use a relative reference is to what we call use the ID tag. So when you have href equals ## or history, we're saying there's another location inside this same file, and it's called history. All right. So absolute versus relative links. When would you use absolute links versus when would you use relative links? With absolute links, you're basically saying, I am not in charge of this page, somebody else is. So if you're linking to someone else's page, absolutely use the absolute link with the full reference in there. For relative is when you're developing your own site, and it's really helpful to use relative links instead of absolute. So that way, if you move your page to a different server or you move it into a different folder, you don't need to rename everything. And so those are some of the benefits to using local links, is just that idea that you don't need to update as much. Now, one of the things that you need to make sure that you never do is have a link that includes some sort of file structure, we'll call it. So check your links. Make sure that it never says C:page or my documents page or anything that is very specific to your computer. The reason that you don't want to do that is if you put your page out on the web, if you're done, you've put it up on a server or a hosting and you want other people to click, well, it doesn't make sense that they would be able to access pages that are on your computer. So never ever have a reference that includes something local to your machine. All right? One of the other things you can do is you can use images as the link. So the clickable component doesn't have to be text, and you've seen this a lot. It can be icons, images, different things along that line. In this case, I went in and I used the regular href, and what we're changing now is not the href, but the content that goes between the opening and closing tag. And I've gone ahead and I've put in an image instead. Make sure that you use the alt text to go along with that image. In another case, I've done something very similar. The only difference is, instead of using a local reference right here for the image, I've used an absolute reference. I've put in the entire URL. So let's talk usability issues and accessibility issues. If you're going to use a clickable component, you want to make sure that it has an informative name. There's software out there that can list all of the links within a page for people who are looking for things who can't use typical means of accessing the page. And it is not at all helpful to them if all the links are labeled, click here, click here, click here, right? You want to give it some sort of informative name. You also want to make sure that if you're using an image for the clickable portion of your link, that that image needs to have some sort of alt text or other information available to those who can't see the image. So let me show you some coded examples of those types of links. All right. As you can see here, I have a reference to absolute references, relative references, images as links, and then some embedded links as well. So if I were to click on Washtenaw Dairy or Rosie's Coffee Bar and Bakery and Dexter's Bakery, etc., it would actually take me to their pages. Head back. One of the tricks I want to point out as I'm doing this is as I hover over each one of these links, if you look at the very, very bottom of my browser, and I can't really show it at the same time, as you highlight it, it shows you which URL you are going to. And I think this is very valuable for people to know, because if you're ever hovering over a link and the information you see at the bottom of the page doesn't match what you expect, I wouldn't click on it. So absolute references take you away from your site. Relative references can take you to something that's within your folder. So right here, I have an image of some donuts, and I've gone on and they're in my folder in my file. So I was able to link to them just using the picture name. All right. We can also use images as links as well. Instead of writing donuts from the Squire shop, I went ahead and made it so you can click on the image to get to the larger view. This last idea of embedded links is a little bit interesting. So let me bring you over to the code for just a second and show you right down here, I have something called relative references with an ID equals relative. I have embedded links with an ID that says embedded. And up here, at the very beginning, you can see I have div ID equals absolute. With embedded links, I can click on any of these and navigate within the same page. So I'm not going to go to a different page. I'm not going to open up a new tab. Instead, I'm going to jump to different places within the page. So I went to absolute. I went to relative. Now, if I try to do embedded references, it doesn't look like it moved, but it really did. It's just that we're already there. All right? So that is how these kind of embedded or internal links work. All right? Now, if at any time you get confused about how code is working, I just want to remind you that you can always go to View, Developer, and View Source to really get a better idea of how people are creating their pages and their links. Next, let's talk about targets. All right? Anchors can take a different target attribute as well. We've got the source, let's add anchor, or target. So you might have target equals self. This is kind of the default action. This is going to happen if you don't put anything at all, if you don't even include target. And what it means is when you click on a link, open up in the same tab or window that you're looking at right now. If you put target equals blank, you're going to leave the current page that you're in exactly the same and open up a new tab or window for where you want the new page to be open. Now this has its upside and downside. The upside is that your site is still open in someone's window. The downside is that many people don't like it when it keeps adding on, and as they progress through your page, you're making them open more and more tabs. There are two other options that we're not going to really talk about here, but you can see them in the reading, and those are top and parent, and that deals if you're really getting into the idea of having multiple windows, frames, etc. open. So let's go ahead and review, because making sure that you understand links is vitally important to your success in this course, or even in just understanding HTML. So the first thing to know is a page without links is extremely rare, and to be honest, it's almost not even a web page, it's just a document. Links can be absolute, relative, and internal. And internal, again, was the kind where it had the hash mark in it. I think I may have referred to them as relative, but I want to make sure I'm clear that the hash mark makes it internal. You want to use caution when using images in links. It's not that they're not a great thing to do, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying make sure that you do it carefully to ensure that everyone who is viewing your page can get the same content and the same experience as everyone else. Hi, in this lecture we're going to talk about multimedia. This is including video and audio into your website. Now video and audio are two of the most popular and two most hated elements of the web. The designers love it because they get to put their cool videos and perhaps some homemade music online and share with everyone. People accessing your site sometimes hate it because they feel like they don't have any control over what they're seeing. So what we're going to talk about today is the HTML5 audio and video elements. We're going to briefly explain the purpose of plugins, And then finally, we're going to reflect on the accessibility issues that come hand in hand with using these types of multimedia tags. So before HTML5, there weren't really any consistent uses of multimedia that were being held across all the browsers. So the new HTML5 is designed to kind of avoid the use of having to use plugins or extra software that you don't already have on your machine. It should really be plug and play. If you're going to put in a video, people should just be able to see it without having to download QuickTime or Flash or anything along that line. Now, it's not a fully implemented tag yet, but it's moving very quickly in that direction. So let's start with the video element. So the video tag uses a source attribute, very similar to the image attribute. You tell the browser where the file is. You can also use what we call embedded source tags, where you might have the video tag and then multiple sources down below. There are a number of attributes that are used very widely. The first two, height and width, are pretty self-explanatory. How big would you like your video to appear in the browser? Autoplay dictates whether or not the video should start as soon as you load the page. Loop will allow the video to play over and over. And the last one, controls, is something you can add to give the person more control over when to stop and start the video. If you use the video tag, it's usually a really good idea to put some text in there along with the different attributes. That way, if the browser for some reason does not support the tag or can't play the video, you get a kind of helpful hint to the user, letting them know there should be a video here that you would be looking at. The audio element is very similar to the video, and then again we use a source attribute to link to the file. Typically, you're going to use an MP3 or WAV file. The attributes, again, very similar. You have autoplay, controls, and loop. But we also have buffered, muted, and volume. And these are extra attributes you can put in where you're going to control what the person's listening to and how loud. Also, when you're using audio, you can set clips where you can go in and say, I want the video to start at this particular time. So in my first example, I wanted to only play the music from 5 to 25 seconds. The next one, you start at the beginning and you only are going to play the first 39 seconds. Again, you can go on and on. I want to start at 1 minute 38 seconds and just go ahead and play to 45. Or in the end, you can just say, hey, start at the 42 second and play from there. So showing you the code for HTML video and audio is pretty much the antithesis of what it's all about. It's supposed to be about looking at things and hearing things. So let's go ahead and look at some code now that's actually working. You can see that I have the source is just my boxcar movie, and I've set the default width to 40. So I'm going to go over here to Sublime and open this up in the browser. There it is, and it's not very exciting. Unless you have super quick eyes and your browser is incredibly fast, you completely miss the fact that it loaded this video and played all the way through. So let's go ahead and try this again, or actually just loaded it and didn't do anything. Let's add autoplay. All right, save it. I'm going to go over here and reload. And now you can see by adding the autoplay attribute, it'll automatically show the video. Now this is something you don't want to do unless you're very certain that the viewer wants to see it. There was a big uproar recently when a social media site started making all the videos autoplay. So if you went on, all of a sudden these videos were playing and it was eating up a huge amount of bandwidth for people. All right? So instead of just doing autoplay, let's go ahead and put in controls. By doing this, you can see we've now added a little control panel to the bottom of the video. People can now start the video, stop the video, and rewind it. This is really the way you kind of want to think about how you can enhance the experience for the user. It is possible to put multiple attributes. And do this. And kind of put them on top of each other. If we do this now, you get to experience my 5-year-old flying down the road multiple times over and over again. Again, you would really want to avoid using loop and also avoid using autoplay unless you're giving people the opportunity to use the controls as well. Okay. One last thing I want to talk about right here is you might notice with controls and loop, these are attributes that don't appear to be taking any values. So source equals, width equals. When you put in these Boolean attributes, it's the same thing as saying controls equals true, loop equals true. So that's how we went through with our video. Let's go ahead and look at the audio for a second. Make this a little bit bigger here. What I have here is I just have a link to the same song 2 times. In my first version, you can see that I'm given the little audio bar because I made sure to use controls, and if I play, it's going to go ahead and play through the whole song. However, in my second option, you can see I've added right here the T equals 1535. I've set it up for you so that you'll really get to hear the song during when the exciting part really kicks in. So these are just some simple examples of how you use the tags to show your video audio. And I really hope that as you're coding, you're making sure to type things along and mess with things and play with things to really get a feel of how these videos and all the different HTML5 tags are working. So one of the things I talk to people about who have been coding in other versions of HTML and don't really want to make the change over to HTML5, that there are so many reasons that you want to make this quick, simple switch. And plugins are an excellent example. Since before HTML5 there was no standard, plugins were required. So what we want to do is go ahead and, even if it's not supported at the moment, go ahead and use this tag, understanding that some browsers may still require Flash in order to play them. Finally, let's talk about accessibility issues. When you're going to use video or audio, just like with any type of non-contextual content, you want to make sure that you provide any type of text descriptions and closed captioning or other equivalent content. You want to make sure that you also provide any links to plugins, otherwise you're pretty much just left with some sort of blank little broken icon that people don't always understand. And finally, the most important thing I'd like you to take away from this talk, beyond being able to use the code, is that multimedia should really enhance your content. You don't want it to be a distraction. You don't want people spending time trying to figure out how to turn it off so they can, in order to really get to the content of your page. Thanks. Hi, today we're going to talk about tables and how you can use them to display your data on your website. So, how I like to put it is that we really used to consider tables as being this evil kind of idea because people weren't using tables for the reason they were supposed to. Instead, they were using tables to kind of set things out, laying them out nicely on the screen. This started to happen back during the time of HTML2, maybe HTML 3.1, and people said, I really want my page to look nice, and I don't have a means to do it, so I'm going to make it a huge table and kind of lay everything out in different rows or columns. This completely throws out the whole idea of separation of content from layout. In addition, it makes it really confusing for people who might be using assistive devices because they're wondering, is this really all a bunch of data, or is there content that should just be kind of formatted in the regular way? So we're going to start talking about tables, and what I really want to do is stress the idea that you should only be using tables if you have some sort of data being displayed. Now, before you even start coding a single thing, I need you to sketch out your layout of what your table should look like. Now, I've told my students this over and over again, and they say yes, yes, and then they start to code, and then they say yes, yes, and then they start to code. And after about the fourth or fifth time, they realize, oh, it's a lot easier to write clean code the first time than to fix broken code. And so then they begin and they think, all right, how many rows and columns do I actually need to represent all of my data? And then you go a step further and say, well, are there any rows or columns where I actually need to span multiple cells, or what we call the little boxes of the table? Because if so, it's going to be a lot easier if I've drawn this out to figure out where I'm going to need in special attributes to make that happen. Because one of the most important things to know when you're doing tables is that the browser is expecting there to be the same number of cells on every single row. If you don't do that, it's going to look very messy. Once you've decided what your table should look like, then it's time to start thinking about the tags. You start off with the table tag, and it's basically just a container element that's going to hold all the other attributes or all the other tags inside of it. You're going to have the table row, and then here for TD, I have columns, but what I really think would be best is to think of this as table cells, not really columns, because what you're doing is you're talking about each individual box. So inside the table, you're going to have one or more table rows, and then inside each table row, you're going to have one or more TD elements, so the columns or the cells. So here's the code for creating a very simple table. Although it looks very convoluted and like there's a lot of things going on here, most of this is just information for the browser. When we look at the actual page that's generated, you'll see that it's very clean and simple. So I have my code for my table on the outside, and then each one of my lines of code here is one row. I have my tr start and my tr end. And then inside each row, I have three elements, 1, 2, 3, which are inside the TD tag. And I'm going to tell you right now that when I initially wrote this code, it looked fine, but I'd kind of messed it up because I had forgotten to put in my ending tags. So make sure when you're coding these that you're being very clean and very concise. And if you do it correctly, this will create a simple table, as I said, with 9 elements in it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is as simple as you can get as far as a table goes. Now, in some cases, you might want to add what we call table headings to your code. Table headings is the idea that at the top of each column, or even at the top or the start of each row, you have some sort of text that's bold that indicates this isn't data, this is actually the name of the data that we're looking at. Now, it's fine, I mean, it's not fine. What some people would do is they would just make these regular TD elements and then perhaps make them bold. So the people who are looking at it can say, oh, hey, look, this is bold, so it must be more important. But we really want to avoid doing that. Instead of using a TD with some sort of bold font, we want to use the semantic tag TH, which stands for table heading. So here, these 3 lines of code are exactly the same as before, but I've added one new row where instead of TD, I have TH. So I have row 1, row 2, row 3, etc. And what you can see here is that what we get is this nice little table heading at the top of each one that is both visually lets the user know that these are headings, but also semantically conveys that same information. So one of the things I mentioned earlier when you're designing your table is you want to decide if you're going to be spanning multiple cells. It might be the case that the table you want to make isn't some sort of perfect tic-tac-toe grid or perfect 9 by 9. So you can combine multiple rows and or multiple columns using the row span and column span attributes. Inside your element, you would include row span equals 2 if you wanted to span 2 rows, or column span equals 5 if you wanted to have it span 5 columns. All right, so let me go ahead and show you an example with some code. And again, I realize, especially if you're looking at this on some tiny little screen, that this seems really like a lot of information to digest in. But it's not really that much going on. I have a simple table where I have my table headings with the child's name and then the parent's name. And then I go ahead and I start putting in a child, and with each child I include their parents. So here I have row span equals 2 for Catherine, which means I actually want my Catherine cell to take up 2 lines. Same with the Edward cell. Maggie I've left completely alone. So let's go ahead and just look at the end result, and I think that's really, if we backward chain, is going to help you understand what this code is doing. So again, I have the child's name, the parent's name, and here are the 2 cells where I did the row span, and you can see it actually took up multiple rows because in this case Catherine and Edward both had 2 parents that we wanted to put it together with. Again, not a hard concept, but it is the case that if you weren't thinking about it and we went back to your code and just started throwing row span and column span in, it just gets very messy and harder to debug. One of the things you might have noticed, at the very top of the table, I included a border attribute. The reason I did that is because I think it's much easier to see this row span here because I have the lines around each cell. So you can use the border attribute to go ahead and put lines in between each one of your cells. And it's very common to do that. But again, in your HTML, I try to avoid styling. It's something we can add later if you decide to learn more about CSS. But it's an attribute that's so commonly used, I wanted to go ahead and put it in there so you could see what was going on. Next, let's talk about captions. So how do we link text to a specific table? What people used to do is they would put in some sort of heading, H2 or H3, and they would put it right above or right below the table. So visually, if you were looking at it, you could kind of figure out, oh, this goes with the table. But again, I really want to push you to use semantic tags. So instead of doing that, you can go ahead and use the caption tag inside the table, and it'll help everyone know that, oh, this caption goes with this specific table. So let's go ahead and review. Number 1, tables should only be used for tabular data. Don't use it for layout. 2, draw your table before you code your table. It's going to save you so much heartache in the end. I promise you that. Finally, and this is the third and most important thing I hope you leave with, is that you need to check for unclosed tags. One of the things that's great about browsers when you're kind of developing locally, you're typing your code and you're testing it and looking at it, is that your browser can usually figure out what you meant to do, even if you messed up. All right? And tables are a good example where you can forget to close some tags, but your browser kind of knows what you meant to do. But later, if you decide to make a table and you're going to upload it, and you really need to make sure that the data in there is valid and represented well, one of the worst things you can do is leave your tags unclosed. So make sure you validate your code whenever you write a table, or really whenever you write any code, and you'll really be able to be sure that you're writing the best code that you can.